Infinity ITS Season 17 is here, and boy, is it a doozy. Representing by far the largest shakeup that ITS as a format has ever had, many old scenarios are gone, many new ones have been introduced, and a lot of the things that we can see in these new scenarios represent pretty significant changes in direction to how I think the developers would like us to play the game and the experience they're seeking to curate. And it's very exciting. We've had about a week now to dwell on and think about these scenarios, particularly the new ones, but even just the ITS pack as a whole. And so today, we'll be going through all of the new scenarios and a list for every one of them. So in short, what will we be covering today? All six, not seven, all six new scenarios. We won't be covering provisioning, even though it is technically new in the ITS pack, because it was spoiled well ahead of the release of the pack, and I actually have a battle report about it already. Now, technically, the scenario saw very small changes between its initial Interplanetario version and the version that made it into the ITS pack. The Interplanetario version had a forward observer specialist bonus, whereas the version in the ITS pack has operational learning, so it's much more flexible for different specialist types, but otherwise everything is still the same. If you want my opinions on it as a scenario, have a look for the battle report that covered provisioning. We talk about it in depth there. That leaves us with six new scenarios, and so we'll be covering each of those, roughly their deployment and mission objectives, but then how are they likely to play, and then a list for every one of those six scenarios, each list from a different faction to showcase some ideas about how you might choose to approach it. Now, a little bit of a caveat as usual. I will have played games with some of these lists. Not all of them will be operating from pure theory, but they are all designed to be at least a little bit silly or funny, because their purpose is to serve as kind of a springboard, to be an idea or a showcase for some of the things that you could do in terms of shaking up the game and changing how you approach the game when tailoring for a specific scenario. That means to take them with a grain of salt. Take a look at them as ideas. We will talk about how I think they will play. But when you're writing lists yourself, even if you're interested in some of the ideas here, tailor them to fit your personal taste, tailor them to fit the mission mix, not just a single scenario that you might be playing. Always make whatever of your own changes you think are necessary. And with that, let's jump into our first scenario, Akial interference. Now, this scenario has stock 12-inch deployment zones, a single antenna in the middle of the field, and no restrictions whatsoever on deployment, no exclusion zones, or anything like that. The name of the game throughout this scenario is the completion of classified objectives. You'll be trying to complete as many as you can. You'll be trying to complete one every turn, and you will have your own private classified objective to try and complete as well, which is worth slightly more points. Now, each round by default, there will be two common classified objectives that you can accomplish, which means if you do nothing but attempt to accomplish those objectives and don't otherwise interact with the special elements of the mission, you can theoretically do 7 classified objectives, your private, and 6 common classified objectives, which is enough to get you maximum score. Now, something important to note is that even though this will play a little bit like countermeasures, one of the things that happened in countermeasures is that when an objective was scored, it was taken immediately by a player. So for example, if you did telemetry during your opponent's turn, you would steal that objective, which could potentially seriously swing the game. In Akial interference, that doesn't happen. Instead, common classifieds are marked as having been accomplished, but they aren't cycled until the beginning of each game round. On top of that, we have the antenna, and that's where a lot of the complexity in the scenario emerges. If you can get a specialist to the antenna, there are two actions that specialist can take, neither of them needing a roll. They can choose to filter the signal. If you perform that action, you choose one of the current common classified objective cards, and if either player has accomplished that card, they score it and they take it. If not, you discard it, and then you draw a replacement classified objective from the deck, which then becomes a common classified objective as normal. This classified objective can then be scored, which means if you have scored the two common classified objectives that are already on the field, this is a way where you can steal some and lock them away, but more importantly, or perhaps as importantly, get additional classified objectives into play so you can surpass that usual limit of 2 common classifieds per turn. Alternatively, you can use the action emit Akial interference, short skill, etc. And this skill allows you to take away or descore enemy objectives if you have scored objectives with a matching icon. There are 4 different symbols, they're in the scenario pack, and I would very roughly describe them as medical symbol, engineering symbol, globe, that's hacking or forward observer symbol, and then I think it's a crosshair. Now, this skill needs a roll, unlike filter the signal, but you can only succeed once per specialist per game round. Even succeeding on this once, though, is a pretty big deal. And it is basically everything to do with the Akial antenna is what really significantly separates this from the scenarios that have preceded it, which were highly classified and then countermeasures. This is kind of an evolution of that, which both adds and removes friction in different ways. Now, the final thing to note, just in terms of talking about scenario elements, is that you have 4 HVTs in this scenario, but there are no restrictions on their deployment other than the usual HVT deployment requirements, which means just like in countermeasures, the option of having a HVT party somewhere off up against the corner of a table edge, heavily watched by multiple arrows and deployables, that was something that you could do in countermeasures, and it will still be something that you can do in Akial interference. My experience in countermeasures was that that was pretty good to do if you were going second, but a little bit more risky of a tactic if you were going first, because your opponent could deploy, if they were the second player, to get basically good approaches towards your HVTs, whereas if you're going second, your opponent probably has to be a bit more spread out, and you can cluster everyone as far away from their concentrations of specialists, etc., while also just setting up AROs that are a little bit more advantageous, a little bit less exposed to enemy super heavy firepower early in the game. Now, like a lot of the new scenarios in this pack, I actually think it's going to be very difficult to predict how this will play until you've had a few games with it. And, full disclosure, I have not, at time of recording, yet played Akial Interference. Nevertheless, my gut instinct, just reading through and mulling over the scenario a little bit, is that the Akial antenna is going to be important, but only as important as both players make it. I think your primary objective most of the time should be the classified objectives. Those are how you win the game. There aren't any points for activating the antenna, it's just that the antenna interacts with your ability to score and the points your opponent has accumulated. And so I think when you are list building for Akial interference, you should treat it pretty much the same as you would have treated countermeasures or highly classified. You should build with as much specialist coverage as you can, and for that reason I'd be pretty wary of playing, for example, Toha or Ariadna in this scenario. Because even though hypothetically either of those those factions can filter out hacking objectives, for example, the central antenna is going to be heavily contested. It will be something your opponent will have eyes on or deployable weapons on. It's going to be a bit of a pain to try and go and filter that. And just the order impost of getting to the center of the board, even though there's no role required for filtering the signal, the sheer order cost is likely to be a pain, or there will be things in place that will make getting there challenging or requiring some sacrifice. So my intention here, and we'll see this in the list that we jump into, is to, in the first instance, build to be able to cover lots of classifieds, and then consider the Akial antenna more as an order outlet once we have done the classifieds for the round. Now, in practice, it's very likely to be more messy than that. It's very likely that you'll have that one round where mapping drops and you're just like, I'm not dealing with that classified. But I think your first goal should be able, to the extent possible, to be able to be comfortably able to do, wow, that was a sentence, one classified at least, ideally two every round, and then think about engaging with the antenna. As we get more runs in with this scenario, we'll probably develop a more nuanced approach, but that's where I would start. And so this is our first list in this video. It's a Dashat company list for Akial interference entitled Fiddler on the Wolf. And while, look, frankly, Dashat Company is a little bit of a challenge in highly classified style missions, it does have the ability to do every classified. And so from the top, what we're starting with is Fiddler. She's doing a lot of heavy lifting in this scenario. She is an engineer and a veteran because she's a character with D-charges. She'll have her 2 jackbots and then 2 Nazmat remotes, both of which will be hanging out near some total reaction bots we have in group 2, but her goal will actually be to, much of the time, move forward. As she's moving forward, reconstitute the total reaction elements we have in group 2. Hopefully that comes as a classified at some point during the game, but she'll be looking to move forward, throw drop bears, place decharges, whatever it is she can do in terms of classifieds. There's a lot that she can accomplish. She's also just very dangerous on her own merits. Those 2 jackbots are not messing around. They are highly mobile and highly dangerous and present a forked ARO where you can't really respond to both of them without dodging. And when Fiddler adds her own firepower into that, it's genuinely very, very dangerous. We then have McMurra. Now, McMurra is fast and impetuous and a veteran and can do close combat things. This is a scenario actually where doing Predator is a little bit more challenging than it might have been in previous scenarios, especially like highly classified, because you've only got one turn usually to get those kills. A lot of the time, I actually think that's going to make it very difficult to score Predator, but if anyone can, it's McMurray. He's also just dangerous on his own merits. He has always been good, and while he's perhaps a little bit weaker in N5, he's still well worth taking. Particularly his ability to just easily get across the halfway line and do a classified like net undermine makes him worthwhile. We've then got a technically 5-person fire team, but that Gulam Lieutenant's going to be left behind a lot. What we're running is Valeria Gromos, Miranda Ashcroft, a Gulam Doctor, and a Gulam NCO. You can have the LT in the fire team to begin with, but here's a very visible LT. It is a risk of this list. Just kind of deal with that, because otherwise what we're getting here is a bunch of utility. We have Miranda Ashcroft. She's very good. We're well aware that she's very good. She's 0 SWC, which really matters in this list because I am splurging on some SWC cost elsewhere. But the most important thing here is that she is a pitcher and a hacker and a veteran. That's Gromos, sorry, in case it wasn't clear. Yes, Ashcroft does shooting. Gromos is adding to the utility of the team. Pitcher, hacker, veteran, can do spotlights. There are multiple guided missile remotes in this list. And then in combination with Ashcroft, well, Ashcroft provides some gunfighting. It's a little bit in terms of soft gunfighting because the E-meta doesn't kill enemies, but in fact, in this scenario, not killing enemies might kind of be valuable. The problem with the E-meta in Akial interference is that it's very, very likely your opponent has engineers, but on the other hand, if combat support drops, being able to non-lethally incapacitate enemies actually could be very useful. I could also see that being quite useful if Predator drops and you need to get someone to just sit still while Mara goes and punches them. So I like access to the E-meta in this scenario, and frankly the combi rifle is dangerous as well. We've then got the Doctor and the NCO. The Doctor is 2-2 classifieds and just general force reconstitution. It's very useful. And the NCO gets us an extra order and smoke, and I think visibility control is going to be very important in this scenario. We are looking at getting McMurray and Fiddler forward if we can, and Fiddler especially does not have her own source of smoke. Having just a nice, accurate, long-range smoke grenade launcher with NCO helps get Fiddler where she needs to go. So this 4-person fire team, right, Gromos through the Gulam NCO, shouldn't move up the field much if it can avoid it, but it should be focused on classifieds it can do without really leaving the deployment zone. If you have spare orders, you can always do Spotlight and then fire off missiles. This list can do that. But that would be one of the last things I would spend orders on, although laying out pitches is very serviceable because we've got lots of baggage here. We then have a Zencha who is just fantastic in this scenario. Now, it's not a veteran or elite, it is spec trained, but apart from that, it is heavy infantry, it has decharges, and it has a regular hacking device, which means it can do a suite of different classifieds. And it's also our only source of Trinity in Dashat, and you can bet that your opponent will have hackers. Okay, cool. You have a pitcher and a good killer hacker. Go and kill them. We've then got a Rushi. Now, there's no ability to give that Rushi marksmanship in this list, but we have ample smoke, and it's got a visor. And that visor is particularly important because there's one classified that needs it. So don't just throw the Rushi away, but it's a source of gunfighting, and you really need that because this list does not have a lot of gunfighting otherwise. And then we have a Tractor Mule Katyusha. Now, I'll be honest, you probably don't necessarily need this, but I've been playing a bunch of Ariadne recently, and I have found that having Katyushas as spec fire devices, not guided fire, spec fire, is kind of hilariously useful much of the time. And especially in Akial interference, it's going to be very likely that your opponent has like one of something. They have one engineer or one doctor. And if you drop a double action round with spec fire on the head of a doctor that's moving into the midfield, you might just lock your opponent out of a whole bunch of classifieds over the course of the rest of the game. So consider the Tractor Mule actually as one of the primary order outlets of this group once we have done any of the classifieds we want to accomplish, and just go after enemy not enemy HVTs, enemy specialists that they've only got one of and whose loss represents a material diminishment of their ability to do the scenario. Combat Group 2 is then, look, it's more meme, shut up. Tractor Mule Uragan. This is not, by the way, going to be the only list where this Tractor Mule stuff makes an appearance, but we've got a Shihab and an Uragan. I mentioned that one of the things you can do in this scenario is build your HVT party, where you cluster 4 HVTs together, and you just defend them heavily, and a lot of this combat group is built around basically being able to do that. The Tractor Mule Uragan is particularly good at shorter range bands, although be aware it has a very long zero range band, and so you can actually get a zero range band that extends out to 40 inches. That's part of what makes it a hilarious spec fire platform, but more importantly, It means you can actually range out past a HMG if you need to, but what you want to be doing with the Uragan is just having eyes on inside 16 to 24 inches against your HVT party. The Shihab is then on kind of longer range aero duty, but it means we have two total reaction bots in this list. Each of them gets, or at least one of them gets, a dedicated Nazmat. You will possibly also need to dedicate a Nazmat to keeping the Spitfire Rushi alive, but you've got a very good engineer with two Nazmats. And then the Libertos as well are kind of looking to be defending the HVT party, particularly the mine layer Libertos. It and its mine should be dedicated to defending your HVTs. The submachine gun Libertos, kind of just whatever you think is most useful. It's not a bad attack piece for very cheap, or it can just go into suppressive fire. It can AO with a chain colt. Half the time you could deploy it like it's a mine, and then surprise your opponent when it actually gets an ARO. And then we have a Hunzakut Forward Observer. This is just another source of repeaters. And that's likely to be important because, frankly, Gromos is going to have a target painted on her head. All of those things I said about, hey, you should kill the one specialist your opponent has that looks vulnerable, your opponent is likely to be making Pitcher plus Trinity attacks against Gromos on the first turn. Now, she can defend herself, and there is going to be a doctor next to her, but there is a likelihood that she won't make it through turn 1, which is why the Zencha is under camouflage. But if the Zencha is under camouflage, and you have to do hacking things with the Zencha, particularly Spotlight, just having another source of a repeater is likely to be valuable. The Hunzakut is also a forward observer itself. Quite a lot of the time, the spare regulars that you have in this combat group will be spent on the Hunzakut moving around, although if you have any spare orders in this group, you can use them on the Tractor Mule, because it can spec fire as well. Both the Uragan and Katyusha have spec fire options, and don't be afraid to make that roll if there's nothing else you've got to do with the order pool. Now, overall, I think it's probably pretty likely that there are better factions to choose to do Akial interference than Dashat Company, but we aren't looking to aggressively optimize for scenario victory with the most powerful factions possible most of the time throughout this video. We're looking to showcase some of the things that you can do. I have not picked the easiest factions to build with, I think almost in any of these cases except maybe for one. But that itself is kind of interesting and cause for optimism. We're going to have Ariadna and Military Orders and Vanilla ALF all present in this video, and those are factions that are not necessarily doing the best, even if some of them will have very ardent supporters, but I have felt like I could do list construction with them that was exciting and interesting in these scenarios. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, that is our Akial interference list with Dashat Company. And our next scenario is corporate appropriation. In this scenario, there are regular 12-inch deployment zones and just a very small 4-inch exclusion zone. I quite like this as a change, by the way. Historically, there have been many Infinity scenarios with very wide 8-inch exclusion zones, rather, and those tend to have a very significant impact on what factions are kind of viable in scenario packs that heavily feature those. The emergence of the 4-inch exclusion zone, you can play anything that is reliant on infiltrators in that scenario. And while those pieces are forced back slightly, it doesn't make those pieces non-viable. So I really like that just as a change. We will be seeing more of those over the course of this pack. I am a fan of the 4-inch exclusion zone. Now, the scenario is going to have two panoplies, one just outside or just on the 12-inch line in the middle of your deployment zones. We can see those, deployment zone A and deployment zone B, and then two prototypes. Those are the blue markers inside the exclusion zone. Before the deployment phase, but after rolling for initiative, the player with the second turn will decide which prototype belongs to each player, which means that each player will have one friendly and one enemy prototype. Over the course of the game, you are attempting to capture the enemy prototype and destroy the friendly prototype. So, for example, if your opponent grabs your prototype and begins to run away with it, you could go after it and attempt to blow it up so that they can't have it, and vice versa. The prototypes can be destroyed with anti-material close combat weapons or by placing decharges, and because they have an automated defense system, overwhelmingly the best option is just to place decharges by using the place deployable skill, since that isn't performing a CC attack and won't trigger the automated defense system. Usually you'll need two decharges to blow up a prototype. You can do it in one, but it's most likely you'll need two. And so plan for that when you're making your attacks, because there's no points for damaging a prototype, only destroying them. So it's going to be 2 points if you capture the enemy prototype, an additional 1 point if you get the enemy prototype to your deployment zone, 1 point if your prototype is not captured, but only if you haven't also destroyed it. So you either are looking for 3 points to destroy your prototype, or 1 point if at least it isn't captured, and then finally 1 point for having acquired more weapons or items from the panoplies, and then 3 classifieds, 1 objective for each. Those classifieds are the only thing you need specialists for in this scenario. Picking up prototypes and blowing up prototypes do not require specialists, and so you can kind of go a little light on with specialists in this mission, although you should still bear in mind that you're going to need to be able to access those classified objectives. Now, there's a very important thing about the prototypes and when you can start interacting with them in this scenario, because you are not allowed to attack the prototypes during the first game round. Now, that sounds like it means, oh, you can't blow them up in round 1. But the pickup prototype short skill has the attack tag. What that means is that you cannot pick up the prototype or destroy the prototype at all in round 1. Now, I'm not 100% that's intentional, but it does make the scenario quite interesting because it means the first round for both players is all about skirmishing and setting up your defenses and making it difficult for your opponent to interact with either of their 2 midfield mission objectives. Now, on top of that, if you do actually manage to pick up and run away with a prototype, there is the additional complication that if you are carrying a prototype, you can only declare move as the first short skill of an order. You can't move. If you've got baggage, you can, but unless you're running a Magari Brigade forward, that's not going to be something that's likely. So what you're looking for in terms of getting away with a prototype is either models with a very long initial move distance, or models with a good dodge distance, because you can move dodge, or both. Final thing to note for this scenario is that while the panoplies function exactly as normal, they can also be used to grab decharges. That's just an obvious design failsafe in this scenario. If a player turns up to play this and they just haven't added any anti-material CCWs to their list, they can access them from the panoply. That's actually very valuable because it means that there are a whole bunch of different models that then could become, if you spend the order, succeed the whip roll, and then pull things out of the panoply, you can choose to gain decharges with any model, which means that theoretically any model can be used to destroy your friendly prototype. That's quite significant. It just means that if you don't build aggressively for that, I think you still should. I think you should still have a plan for models to just have decharges, because you don't have the order tax of going to the panoply and pulling the decharges out, maybe failing the whip roll, etc. You just avoid all of that. But in a pinch, you've always got a way to destroy your own prototype. Now, in terms of how this scenario will play, at the moment as it's written, I think it's going to be very heavily defined by the fact that turn 1 can't be used really to interact with the core elements of the scenario. If you have your first turn, whether you're going first or going second, in your first turn, you want to be focused on a couple of things. If you can, it's an excellent time to do classifieds. It's also an excellent time to just punch your opponent really hard a whole bunch. And then finally, set up defenses or defensive positions or strong points or materiel around the panoplies to make them difficult to interact with. This is, for example, a scenario that's really good for mine dispensers because you know where your opponent is going to want to go, and your opponent will not be able to go there and interact with those game elements until round 2, which means both players have a window to go absolutely spam happy if they want to with mine dispensers, which potentially makes that a powerful piece of equipment in this mission. Now, once we get past the first round, and there's been that initial punch, skirmish, shut up your defenses, etc. phase, at that point it becomes a smash and grab mission, where the ability to move forward, probably under smoke, trip or trigger enemy deployable weapons, grab or destroy the panoplies, and get out becomes important, and you can theoretically do that without interacting with your opponent if you've got good visibility control. But that doesn't happen until the second round, so you need a plan for the rhythm of this game. And with that in mind, we have our second list for the video. Our corporate appropriation list is called Ariadnan Reaction Order, and it is a very silly Ariadna list. Now, this is actually a list that I have played at least archetypes of previously. I can vouch for this being better than it has any right to be from looking at it at first glance, but I promise you this is playable. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that it's not just playable, but it's actually probably pretty good in this scenario. So from the top we have 2 combat groups, a 6-9 split, although you will have 2 models in combat group 2 off the table for some of the game. Combat group 1 is a Neurokinetics Vistral, and then a Tractor Mule Uragan, total reaction, which are the first 2 of 3 total reaction elements in this list. We've then got a Dozer. That Dozer has an electronic, so just 1 peripheral. I would actually really like 2 in this list, but there are not really the points. And then 2 dynamos. These are the cheapest dynamos. They have no SWC cost. There is no need for the Paramedic or AP Spitfire or anything ones in this list, because we want them for linked smoke and linked mine dispensers and the ability to drive fast forward, grab a panoply, or grab a prototype. I'm going to keep making that mistake. They both start with P. Grab a prototype and get away. Because dynamos have 8-4 move, they are excellent at running away with the prototypes. And because they've got a good dodge distance, they can dodge 3 inches, so they have the option of move dodging, but because of the mine dispensers and the smoke grenade launchers, they still have a productive outlet for their second short skill as they're fleeing with the prototype. So these guys are actually very important to the broad plan of the list, where you want to have them kind of safe initially, but spend 2 orders to fire off 4 mines into the midfield to be very annoying on turn 1. And then on turn 2, these guys are part of your smash and grab plan. We've also got, in addition to the Dozer and the electronic, we've got a Kibbervolk. Always take the 12-point Kibbervolk. Early in the game, a lot of what he's going to be doing is laying down crazy koalas. That's really good. There are 2 baggage bots in this list, so you can always be reloading your stuff. And then when the time is right, he can move forward. He has a sensor, so he's quite good at clearing out things your opponent might have put in place to secure the midfield, so use the sensor for that. And then if you need to, he's 6-6 move, and you can just run him all the way through a minefield and blow everything up so that the dynamos can make their run. This second combat group is doing an awful lot of work and has been hugely successful in my games with Ariadne this edition so far, like far defying expectations, and is actually planning on doing quite a lot of the heavy lifting in this scenario by itself. Also, just to note, one of the funniest things you can do with this list is to have your reserve drops be the Vistral and one of the Tractor Mule Uragans, because then it's just like, bam, 2 total reaction bots as my AROs. Now, you do need a bit of foresight in terms of where your electronic and your Dozer are going to go to make sure that you can bring those models back when they get put down. But I have done things like deploy both of those overwatching enemy Panoshianian troops, both of them at like 40 inches, where the Uragan ranges out an enemy HMG, and of course the Vistral has a sniper rifle, and it's just really funny, in addition to being surprisingly good. In Combat Group 2, then, we've got Colonel Veronin. You really need him in this list for the extra order, because we've got 2 drop troops. But as noted, Strategos can be very valuable in this list. We've then got the Unknown Ranger. The Unknown Ranger has fallen a very long way from grace, but he is a 1 SWC gun and a specialist and has an anti-material weapon. I do not want to use him to attack the friendly prototype if I can possibly avoid it, but the option is there, and he's just a way to spend points, and he fits in SWC-wise into the list. He is fine. He's not going to be doing any of the things that he did in previous editions, but he's still basically okay. We've then got a Polaris team. We have the chain rifle at Polaris and then Masha. This is another source of anti-material, and although the trench hammer is disposable, it hits extremely hard and is so liable to do damage pretty quickly to the panoply. Otherwise, just good value pieces. The bear pod is good, not as good as it was in previous editions, but it is still good. We've then got Margot and Duroc. These are especially valuable in this scenario. If your opponent is going first, and they clear all of your mines, and they get your panoply, and they escape with it, destroying it once it's back in the opponent's deployment zone is often going to be really challenging for a lot of lists. But in this case, Duroc can make a hole and lay some smoke, and Margot has decharges, which means you have, in that admittedly very expensive single package, the best 2 model option in the game for destroying a prototype that your opponent has gotten back to their deployment zone. That's very valuable, and if that doesn't happen, they're still Margot and Duroc, and they do Margot and Duroc things, which are very valuable and useful. We've then got our third total reaction bot, which is a Tractor Mule Uragan. You need to learn how to deploy these, just by the way. You really need to get an eye for the up to 24 inches good range band, and then the out to 40 inches zero range band. You cannot have these things ranged in on within 30 inches by an enemy HMG, because as soon as that happens, they've got +3, you're at 0, your ballistic skill is crap just to begin with. It's a hot mess. You have to abuse the weird range bands that Uragans have, but if you do that, they are genuinely viable and not too expensive total reaction bots who can incidentally spec and guided fire. Now, there are no forward observers in this list. We're not going to be doing the Ariadne and guided, but any spare orders that you have, like at any point during the game, you're like, not sure what to spend these orders on. You spec fire. You've got that in both combat groups. Both Uragans can do it. And if you do it enough, I guarantee that at some point during a game, you're going to be like, oh, I rolled a 4. Oh, that's a crit. I hit your lieutenant. They can die now, please. It's just very... It is not consistent. It's obviously not consistent. You're looking at 7s in good range and 4s in 0 ranges. But you have the option there, and if you have spare orders, you should pursue it. Then finally, there is a Mine Layer Scout. Now, this Scout was chosen over other Mine Layer options. For example, a Chasseur is cheaper. The Scout was chosen despite being more expensive, firstly because an EM mine is very useful. There are things that can disrespect the shock mines your dynamos will lay that can't disrespect an EM mine, but more importantly, the Scout has decharges. Just having a model under camouflage in the midfield that is just there and ready to move in on an objective could be very order efficient and very useful. And you actually do need to be kind of order efficient with this second combat group, because even though you've got a tactical awareness order and a strategos order, Margot and Duroc will be off field much of the time. And so the order pool is not massive until they arrive. Finally, we have a Desperado. Now, by the way, there are a lot of Silhouette 4 models in this list. One of them has Sapper, which helps. Some of them are aero pieces, which helps, but there are still a lot. I would really like this Desperado to not be a Desperado. Desperados are very good, and they're very good in this scenario. They are 8-4 movement, they're good at running forward and getting the prototypes just the same as Dynamos are. But in an ideal world, this would be an Ermendino. An Ermendino would add a lot to the list. He would add more decharges. He would add another engineer. In perfect world, it would even be an electronic and an Ermendino. But the only way to get those points would be to downgrade the scout. And while you could do that, I didn't really want to. Consider that as a tweak. Also, frankly, consider not taking 2 tractor mule Uragans. That's decidedly an option. You do not need 2 of them. It's just very funny. But even with those like little meme additions, I do have some confidence in this list overall, and I think we are starting to see, if not, wow, Ariadne is very strong, because there are whole elements in here that are just like, huh, the Unknown Ranger seems like a much worse version of a 33-point character some other faction would have kind of issues. We are nevertheless seeing the emergence of Ariadne lists that are kind of cool and interesting and can win games. Now, our next scenario is critical intervention, and we're going to do 2 different slides here because critical intervention is the first officially asymmetric scenario in an ITS packet, which is really interesting. Again, in both cases, 12-inch deployment zones for both players, and there is an objective room in this scenario. The objective room will contain a console, which will hold a data pack and 2 armed turrets. And on the defender's side of the table, behind the objective room, is another console, technically called an inhibitor antenna, which can be interacted with by both players to have different effects on a player-by-player basis. The attacking player can activate it to turn off the turrets in the objective room if they are active, and to unlock the data console, which makes it considerably easier to interact with, and the defending player can interact with it to turn the turrets on if they are off, although I would make the observation that my expectation most of the time is that the turrets will be turned off by the attacker by shooting them and destroying them, because they have the regular turret stats and you just kill them. There is also a 4-inch exclusion zone on either side of the halfway line, but this exclusion zone only applies to the attacker, and the defender can infiltrate elements entirely as normal. The usual rule against infiltrating or deploying models inside the objective room applies to both players, but there is a special rule for the defender where at the beginning of the game they can spend 1 command token to do one of the following. They can either ignore the usual restriction on deploying in the server room and deploy up to 65 points of your army anywhere in the server room. Now, important to note here is that this allows you to put non-infiltrating troops that far forward. There is that specific carve out, you don't need to be infiltrators, so any 65 points you could choose to throw up into the objective room. Most of the time I would not be inclined to do that. I would rather defend normally, I would rather have eyes on the approaches to the objective room, just build a more normal list, because putting 65 points forward, unless you have a very specific plan for what those things are, I would be just a little bit loath to risk those pieces, because you actually, we'll talk about this, you don't necessarily need to worry too much about the objective room as the defender. But more importantly, you can spend that command token as the defender to just have the game start with the turrets active. And having the turrets active is going to force your opponent to deal with them. And I think that is the higher value of the command token in this case, unless you have a very specific plan. Now, as the attacker, you have to respect the exclusion zone fully, you can't deploy in the objective room at all, and your objectives are 1 point to unlock the data console, you do that by activating the inhibitor antenna, 2 points for extracting the data pack from the data console, you do that by interacting with the data console, You use a specialist and you make a normal willpower roll with a willpower -6. That -6 penalty goes away if you have unlocked the data console using the inhibitor antenna. Now, there is only one data pack, and whichever trooper extracts it has it for the rest of the game, and if they die, it is lost. Just bear that in mind because it's a very big deal. You do not want to be going after the data pack with a Fusilier hacker. That is a really good way to just piss points up against the wall. You want to go after it with something that can survive. Now, you will get the points if you extract it regardless, but you really want that trooper not killed at the end of the game and alive in your deployment zone for 2 points at the end of the game. There are also 2 points for dominating the server room. This is going to be a little bit challenging because you are going first, but there are 2 points for that. And then there are 2 points for killing at least 75 points of the enemy. That should be very easy to accomplish. You should basically always do that. So you can expect to have 2 points plus any of the above. Finally, there is one classified objective. Sorry, quick correction, 1 point for killing at least 75 points, which gets you to the 10. So 1 point for data console, 2 points for extracting the data pack, 1 point for having the trooper that extracted not killed, 2 points for getting them back to your deployment zone, 2 points for dominating the server room, 1 classified, and 1 point for killing 75 points of the enemy. If you are the defender, you get 1 point if you prevent the attacker from unlocking the data console, 3 points if you prevent the attacker from extracting the data pack, 2 points if you kill the trooper that extracted the data pack, 3 points dominating the server room, 2 points for killing at least 150 points of the enemy. That is more challenging, but in my experience, generally speaking, you will find yourself doing that in a lot of games, and then 1 classified objective. That also gets you to 10. Now, in terms of analyzing this scenario, there are actually quite a few things to think about, and I want to just start with a bit of a take on, oh wow, an asymmetric mission. A mission with an attacker and a defender. This is actually not weird. I am going to make the claim that Infinity has always had asymmetric missions. I want to just kind of get that one out there, because it's something I think people have been overlooking, and I have strong opinions about this. Every scenario in Infinity ever has been asymmetric because there is a difference between going first and going second, and sometimes that difference is significant. Playing Supremacy as first player versus second player is a wildly different experience, and I would say much of the time kind of as variable as Critical Intervention is going to be. What Critical Intervention does is it codifies that choice, and then it balances the mission objectives for going first and going second. I think that's really cool, but I do think there's been a little bit of noise around, oh wow, an asymmetric mission, when actually Infinity has just always been asymmetric, literally forever. Now, in terms of approaching this scenario, I think it is an easier scenario as the defender. And this is actually just down to how the points play out. Firstly, as the attacker, the scenario is order intensive. If you look at all of the things you want to do, you need to unlock the console, and then you need to grab the pack. You need to clear any defenses that are in the zone as part of doing that. Then you need to get away, and then you need to survive, and then you need to do a classified, then you need to kill some things, and then potentially you need to try and come back and dominate the zone at some point before the end of the game, and have dominated the zone at game end. All of those collectively are tricky. Now, if you do killing some enemies, and you get a classified, and you unlock the data console, and get the pack, even if the trooper that extracted it dies, you get to 5 points, right? 1 for kills, 1 for classified, 1 for data console, 2 for the data pack. You should be able to lock all of those down by game end. You should be able to do all of those. What is not certain, under any circumstance, is that you can keep the trooper that extracted the pack alive, because your opponent will always have the last turn. They will always have the ability to try and dive that piece, even if it is just with spec fire or missiles. And then on top of that, unless you are really slamming your opponent, dominating the server room is not guaranteed either, because your opponent will have the last turn. And what that means is that there is a significant onus on the attacker, because when we get to the defender, we will see that the defender's kind of easy paths get them 6 points rather than 5. Now, it's close. Any one thing the defender fails to do will trip the game. But I think in this game, the attacker bears the greater burden. Now, that's probably good because they are still the attacker. They are still the person that gets to go first. They are still the person that gets the first swing with Trinity and guided strikes and impersonators and parachutist deployment zones and tag alpha strikes and all of the different things that you can do to make the second player's life a misery in this game. But I think all of that is heavily balanced by the fact that the attacker just has more that they need to accomplish. Even getting to the antenna, the inhibitor antenna, and pressing that, and then getting back to the objective room, and then extracting the thing and running away is liable to occupy a lot of the game, and if you do it on the first turn and you don't beat your opponent up a whole bunch, you're possibly setting yourself up for a really difficult remainder of the game. I think it's very interesting, but I think the game is weighted maybe 55-45 in the defender's favor. And that's because if we look at the defender's objectives, they are simpler. Now, I think you should operate on the assumption that you will probably not prevent your opponent from unlocking the console, and probably not prevent your opponent from extracting the data pack. Those 4 points will not be scored terribly often unless you are absolutely smashing your opponent in like Aero or something. However, you should, much of the time, be able to kill the enemy trooper that extracted the data pack if you've got the tools for it, and you should, at the end of the game, be able to dominate the server room, and then the entire rest of the points you need to win if you do those two things are just kill some stuff. And as a rule of thumb, killing 150 points is maybe a little bit of a challenge, but not too difficult. And then you have to do a classified. And in this pack, doing classified is really, really easy because this is a scenario with both the treasure token and the HVT. So you just have to secure one of those. You don't even need to do anything. If you've got a Sasha in your list and they survive to the end of the game, you will get that 1 point. And so, doing those things, killing the enemy trooper that extracted the data pack, dominating the server room, and killing stuff, plus just having a Sasha next to a treasure, will score you 6 points to your opponent's 5 and win you the game. Now, any one of those could feasibly fail. You might fail to kill the trooper that extracted the pack if they are a long way back and safe and well defended and behind a huge network of like hackers who are just ready there to stop you from using Spotlight, and they are a very durable piece, you might not kill them. In that case, your opponent could win that way. You also might just not get 150 points of enemy army kills, or not be able to dominate the zone. All of those things could potentially happen, but I think if you are going second, that should be your plan, and it is a relatively simple plan. It doesn't put as much of an impost on you. You still got to accomplish it, but I think probably 55-45, the game is weighted in the defender's favor. And so in terms of lists that we're looking at here, we want to be thinking about how can we do this as the attacker, and how can we do this as the defender? And I think the defender has the easiest plan, and that plan is to just be a jerk. It's to play guided missiles or spec fire, be hard to kill, just defend with expendable stuff, and then go after and kill the enemy model that extracts the pack once that happens. And with that in mind, I am pushing the cop-out button and just putting this on the field. This is the old combined army bollocks. It is a little bit degenerate and it plays just fine in this mission. Also, frankly, to level with you, I have been writing lists for this video over about the course of this week, and Critical Intervention was the last one of 2 that I wrote prior to going live for this video. And I experienced severe mood whiplash after trying to write a funny list name for Zone of Interest, which we'll talk about a little bit seriously when we get to that scenario. After which point I was not having a good time anymore. And so we're just phoning it in for this one, but this list will fit this mission just fine. I know this list is good, and therefore that it manages the challenge of both going first or second in Critical Intervention. The goal is to establish info dominance with your pitchers and very, very good hackers, belt the enemy, throw missiles at them, use crackouts to trip enemy deployable weapons, and then use the anathematic to clear the room. I will note if you're going first, the anathematic at whip 16 actually can potentially just brute force through the data pack without first clearing the interference, but you should have ample smoke. And with enough orders, the anathematic could also quite easily activate the data pack, grab the console, and get the hell out. Activate the interference antenna, unlock the panel, grab the pack, and get out. And then it's one of the most durable models in the entire game for just surviving. It is difficult to hack. It is difficult to shoot. It can't go back into a marker state, but just hiding it in the corner of the table if you're going first should get you a very long way toward a win. If you're going second, you're just going to be an absolute menace in this scenario because you just have to peel away enemy troop after enemy troop, and as soon as something unlocks the pack, land pitches on its head, throw missiles at it until it dies, and then just skate to victory in the way that we discussed. If you need to, use Pandora to reconstitute Datarazi and crackouts that have gone down. But frankly, much of the time, what you'll be looking to do is just trade out and kill because you want to tick over that 150 points killed threshold. Even if you do it with missiles, make sure that you get just enough kills and do enough damage that you can pursue that 6-point win. Don't focus on trying to stop the enemy. from taking the pack if you are going second. Just aim to have like the last turn of the game be land some pitches, spotlight the target, move the anathematic forward, missile down the enemy model that is carrying the data pack, and then walk the anathematic or the Carontid into the objective room, dominate it, and win the game that way. This is not an especially tailored approach, but I do think that writing a list for critical intervention that can do both go first and go second represents a significant challenge and is actually going to be one of those cases where, to start with, just take a list that's really good. Just take a list that is strong, play the scenario a little bit, and then try and figure out where your edge cases are, because different elements will be better or worse in different cases. Now, on a much lighter note, we have possibly the funniest scenario in the new pack, crossing lines. Now, this is a scenario that is actually vaguely reminiscent of a scenario I once wrote called Ships in the Night that was written intentionally as a meme, but it takes some of those ideas and uses them, and I have actually played Crossing Lines, and it was fun. So in Crossing Lines, we have two normal 12-inch deployment zones, but then we have exclusion zones in the space 8 inches outside each deployment zone, and then a deployment zone A and B in the middle of the table. Your deployment zone A for player A is on the far side, closer to the opponent's deployment zone B, and vice versa, which means that each of you, if you choose to avail yourself of those smaller deployment zones, will have a small buffer of troops between your army and the enemy primary element that is there immediately ready to fight. Your opponent will have the same, so there are potentially 150 points of the 600 total points available to the two players collectively that are literally just deployed in the middle of the table, ready to have a fight. From there, your actual mission objectives don't really involve fighting at all. Instead, at the end of each game round, you're looking to dominate those dead zones in between the deployment zones. 1 point for dominating each of them, which is 6 points total over the course of the game, and much of what you need. Then 2 points for having dominated both of them at the end of the game, and 1 point for each of the two antennas in the middle of the table. There are no classified objectives, and that's very important because it is impossible to legally deploy a HVT in this scenario. The scenario doesn't actually tell you that it's a HVT not used mission. It also doesn't tell you that it's a treasure not used mission, but there is no way to legally deploy either of those elements in this scenario because you cannot have them more than 4 inches from any deployment zone. Those are only 8-inch bands. There is literally nowhere on the table that a treasure or a HVT can go, so my assumption is that you just don't deploy either. Now, in this scenario, you cannot use superior deployment at all unless it is infiltration. You can use airborne deployment. Airborne deployment is not superior deployment, but bear in mind that the exclusion zone still exists, so if you're trying to land an airborne deployment trooper, it is going to have to either land in your opponent's deployment zone or that middle area or your deployment zone, but if you've left some points in your 75 points total, and you fail the roll to land, you could bring it on in your midfield deployment zone, and the list that will show off actually has a way of doing this. Now, in terms of playing and approaching this mission, my take on this is that it is basically trying to be the best bits of Biotech 4 without the Biotech 4. Because what you have, and what I found having played some games of this, or a game of this, that's not bullshit, having played a game of this, is that the first turn is this immediate shootout at the OK Corral situation, where the forces in deployment zone A and B and the little ones in the middle of the field are going to have a fight kind of immediately, but that both players will be preparing for that. If you are the player going first, you should have some kind of a plan for the elements you're going to deploy there to be offensive and to clear the pieces in your opponent's small deployment zone. And if you are the player going second, you should have a plan for very defensive or difficult to kill or annoying to kill, or good trading pieces to put in your small deployment zone to efficiently shred away the pieces that your opponent is using to attack you. Now, another interesting thing that is really relevant here is the way that Impetuous works in this scenario, which is that Impetuous models deployed in the small deployment zone, the closest enemy DZ to those Impetuous models will be to bring them back toward the small deployment zone. So Impetuous models will generally go backwards in their first impetuous activation of the game, but having reached that deployment zone, they'll then have some flexibility in how they move. Basically, you have this interesting scrap that occurs in the two central deployment zones before the game kind of settles into a bit more of a normal game of Infinity, but starting off almost like in medias res, if that makes sense, starting off with just like action immediately on the first order and the second order and the third order and the fifth order of the first player's first turn, but action that is nevertheless kind of on both players' terms was just a really high octane game of Infinity, and I really liked that. Frankly, what I was surprised by was that it wasn't as zany as it might potentially have been. There was a bunch of violence and a bunch of things died, and then the game moved into a bit more of a normal game of Infinity, but it never felt like it was wacky. It was just high octane, and that's kind of cool. Now, in terms of approaching this, one of the things that we will see and listen about the showcase, but I think really does need to be stressed, is that you want a plan as to what 75 points of troops you'll deploy or less going first or going second. Don't just be like, this is always the 75 points that I will deploy. That is a really good way to get those elements chewed up if you are not the first player. The first player has the luxury of being very offensive in that space. The second player should really think about defensive and trading elements. Stuff like dogged warbands like Galwegians would be just absolutely perfect. Echidrons are quite good because they're repeaters with flamethrowers. But if I was playing combined, for example, I wouldn't just windmill slam a whole bunch of monkeys into my deployment zone, my small deployment zone, because they're actually kind of expensive. Yes, I could theoretically put 5 14-point models in there, but then my opponent will kill those models with their own offensive elements. I want those pieces ready to attack on my terms, not just to make chain rifle attacks. 14 points is too expensive just to throw a chain rifle in a row. 5 points, however, is not. So when you are building a list for crossing lines, once you've built the list, my recommendation is make a third combat group and just see what you can move into that combat group and be like, if I go first, I'll deploy these things. That's only 30 points, but I'm fine with that. If I go second, I'll deploy these things. That's only 20 points. I'm fine with that. Just whatever you think. You can go heavier if you are the first player. Probably should go heavier if you're the first player. But if you're the second player, consider being actually a bit more careful with your small deployment zone. Just putting in things that will effectively trade against your opponent's forward deploying pieces, and then using your reserve drop or drops to deploy those elements effectively. And so our sample list for crossing lines is a Hakislam list, Fig Jammers, and we've got very specific plans for what will be deployed in each case, going first or going second. Now, the list from the top, Zamira and Zalakia, a Hassassin Barid, a Janissary in a duo with Layla Sharif. That means we're going to have, by the way, 3 hackers, Layla Sharif, a Barid killer hacker, and then just a Ghulam hacker. That gives us relatively limited investment, a nice coverage, including 1 6th Sense killer hacker with Carbonite. Now, it can be a little bit vulnerable to enemy hacking alpha strikes, but it also isn't spending that many points, and is a very nice kind of like minimum viable investment in your hacking market. We've got Saladin. He is very useful, especially if you're going first, even if you're going second. The Strategos deployments in this scenario, that second or third reserve drop, are multiplied by deploying into the midfield. And so even though I use Saladin a little bit less in Hackislam lists these days, this is a good use case for him. We've then got a Fanus remote and the first of 3 Ghazi Matawiya. This one just has a chain rifle and a jammer, and then a Hassassin Rajik. The Rajik is the exact same cost as a Hassassin Fidei, but I went with it over the Fidei because I think it fits the airborne deployment, I think fits the scenario a little bit better, and I have played with this list in this scenario, and yeah, the Rajik absolutely popped off and killed a wrecker and was really, really cool. We then have a Magariba Guard duoed with a Havsa. The Havsa is 17 points and places repeaters. It's really not doing anything particularly special, but it is cheap. And the Magariba is obviously very good in this scenario because just by itself, it's 91 points bombing into any zone, which is usually enough to secure any zone on the board, particularly if you're going second. This can be one of those scenarios that is very even back and forth with each player dominating their zone for much of the game. And having a model that can just like tow over into the enemy half of the table and be like, nope, I've got this one, can be very strong. We've got a Magariba pilot. She's got a gizmo kit and a med kit. She's just useful. And then 2 more Ghazi Matawiyas with boarding shotguns, jammers, and smoke grenades. And as mentioned, the list has got different plans for what's going to go into those forward areas, depending on if it's going first or if it's going second. If it's going second, you actually just want very limited in terms of investment. You are putting some Matawiya, maybe the Fanus if you think you want the repeater, and that is it. You are not heavily contesting those zones But the Matalia, just deployed in as safe and annoying positions as you can make them, those are really annoying and are designed to make your opponent's forward deployed elements have as miserable time as possible. If you're going first, you will still deploy maybe one or two Matalia and the Hassassin Barid so that it's in a nice comfortable range to make pitcher attacks on your opponent's deployment zone. You will leave 23 points spare so that the Rajik can walk in if he fails his roll to land, and then your reserve drops will be Zamira and Zuleika. That's collectively not a lot of points, but it is very high impact, and deploying both of the biker girls, even though their impetuous moves will carry them backwards, they are still going to be staged aggressively and very dangerous to engage and destroy whatever your opponent has put in their small deployment zone, or run forward and attack if they aren't contested. And so in both cases, there's this sort of like very clear and clean line of deployment, very limited investment if you're going second, more significant but primarily impetuous and irregular investment if you're going first, which works very well both ways. Something that is just worth noting as well about this scenario is that I've heard some people like really wish list all the different things that they could put in that central area. Guys, just remember, it's a 4-inch wide area in the midfield. You have no guarantee of cover and no guarantee of good locations. Yes, there are a whole bunch of tags in the game that you can theoretically put in that spot for 75 points or less, and just with zero guarantee that they will be remotely safe if you deploy them there. It is not a comfortable deployment space. You should mostly be thinking about models that can't take cover anyway, models that can hide, and models that can camouflage. Hidden deployment is actually very valuable, and I will make the note, as you'll see there, that this list only barely edged out a combined army list because you can put a 74-point Sepsitor and a Thematic in that zone, which is the funniest possible thing I can think of to put in that zone. That will be something that I will try at some point, but this is what I wanted to actually play the first time around. I have played with this list, it worked very well, and it was a very good showcase of how you need to be respectful of the limitations of what these deployment zones give you in this scenario. Now, our second last new scenario is Hardlock. This scenario looks like capture and protect with extra steps, but it is not. It is acquisition or power pack with extra steps, and I will explain why. You have the usual 12-inch deployment zones. There are 3 antennas across the middle of the field, or consoles across the middle of the field, and 1 beacon, 24 inches in and 12 inches up on the edge of your deployment zone. The beacons handle exactly the same way as they do in capture and protect, but you cannot pick up a beacon until you have activated a console. So in order to make a run on the opposing beacon, you must first activate a console. That's why this looks a lot like capture and protect with extra steps, but when we look at the mission objectives, what we will see is 1 point at the end of each game round for controlling the enemy beacon, 1 point at the end of the game if your beacon is not controlled, 2 points at the end of the game for having activated more consoles, 1 point for having each activated console, and then 1 classified objective. And what this means is that if you can just keep your beacon safe, and if anyone has played Capture and Protect, you will know it can be very variable, but there are a lot of games of Capture and Protect where just nobody is able to quite get a handle on the opposing beacon, and sometimes it's like 1 point is scored by the second player just running into contact with it, and you can still do that in this scenario, by the way. You can score 5 points just by doing your classified, and remember, secure both the treasure and HVT are passed doing a classified in this season, and activating 2 consoles at the end of the game. If you do that, you'll have 1 point for each console, that's 2, 2 points for more consoles, that's 4, and then you're classified, that's 5. And if no one has done anything to any of the beacons, you'll score a major win, in fact going to 6 if your beacon is not controlled. And so what I think that means is that kind of the way to approach this scenario is actually like the old days of this kind of mission with 3 antennas across the middle of the table, where all of the points, or most of the points, came down to having more of them at the end of the game and where their control could be flipped. And that means this is the scenario of hidden deployment infiltrating specialists. Now, is that the only way to play the scenario? No, absolutely not. You can aggressively go after the enemy beacon, and if you do, it can score you a bunch of points. And for that reason, this is probably a better scenario than those old day power pack style scenarios, because those had only one path to victory. And something that is actually kind of common across a lot of these ITS Season 17 scenarios is that there is consideration to how each of them might play out in different ways. Like big thumbs up there, generally very positive appraisal. But for this one in particular, I think my main takeaway is if you're going first, you should play it probably a little bit like capture and protect with extra steps. But if you're going second, you shouldn't. You should focus much more on the antennas and having your beacon protected, but then pressing the antennas by the end of the game. That's the better second player approach, and it's what the list that we're building today is trying to do. Now, it's not often on this channel that I feature military orders content. It's not my kind of faction. I do not play it very often / at all. But here we go, a military orders list. And that's because Trinitarians are the best models in the game just about for that late game antenna grab. There are 2 in this list in Combat Group 2 there. Both of them are forward observer mine layers. And both of them are aiming, especially if you're going second, to just chill out for much of the game and then jump onto the objectives on the last round, where your opponent has, unless they have a sensor, there is no way for your opponent to interact with those pieces until they make the play that wins the game. Now, around those Trinitarians, this list went through a couple of different iterations because the initial versions were not proper Pan-Oceanian lists. And so big thanks to my friend Lockie, that's the border on the Discord, for workshopping this with me, by which I mean yelling at me until I added a real gun, because I think the first 2 variations of this list had nothing that could shoot over range 24 inches, apart from maybe a Thunderbolt. And so from top to bottom, we have Joan of Arc, Lieutenant. She is in a duo with a Knight Hospitaller Doctor. The Hospitaller is a specialist, can be a Doctor for Joan, but then also that is a pure combat group duo, which means Joan is burst 5 on 15s, which is hilarious. We then have a Sasha and a Warcore. Those were another big part of why we're playing Joan, because she is an inspiring leadership lieutenant, and 9 points for the Sasha and the Warcore for 2 regular orders is a very good deal. We then have a Peacemaker. Initial versions of this list had 2. One is sufficient to defend your objective, and it very much should be used to defend your beacon, especially if you're going second. We then have a 3-person Haris of a Bulleteer, a Curator, and an Order Sergeant FTO. The Order Sergeant gives you just a little bit of reasonable quality hacking to play off of the repeaters, particularly the Peacemaker. The Bulleteer is linked. This is a 2-person team with an extra model, so it's got 2 troopers of the same type, the Curator and the Order Sergeant, which means the Bulleteer is burst 5. And of course, the Curator can repair the Bulleteer if it goes down. The Curator can also just lay AP mines, which is something if you're securing your beacon, just doing that as you're moving around the field or moving up the field can be useful. Of course, the Peacemaker and its Oxbot has mines as well. We've then got a Fugazi and a Mulebot. The Mulebot is just to enable reloads of things, since there are lots of models here with deployables. In Combat Group 2, then, we have a Tech B. Hey look, another deployable repeater. A Raveneye. Its EM mine will absolutely be used to help secure your beacon. Then 2 Trinitarian mine layer forward observers. If you're counting at this point, that is 4 mine layers, one of which is an EM mine and 3 of which are shock mines, and then a Knight of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the piece that Lockie insisted that I add, and very reasonable that he does so. It is a very big long-range gun, and this list needs at least some long-range guns. Early versions of the list did have a duo I was very happy with, which was an Order Sergeant plus Indigo Brother Konstantinos for linked disco balls, but realistically, this is a Pan-Oceanian faction. You should take a big Pan-Oceanian gun, and the Sepulchre Knight even gives you an outlet for your Lieutenant order if Joan is just hanging out in that duo and not using her inspiring leadership order. Much of the plan here really is playing around going second. Admittedly, this is not really a list that is hugely built for going first. We are mostly looking to defend and reconstitute and bleed out our opponent and make that last turn win, but you should be able to turn most of these tools to a first turn win through kind of the same approaches. You don't have a sensor, which is something that might be valuable in this scenario for all of the reasons I've been talking about, but you do still have an awful lot of mine layers, and if you are going first, you probably want to use the Trinitarians not using their hidden deployment, just deploying as camouflage markers, and use both them and their mines to zone out enemy mine layers so that you can grab the objectives and then lay mines to secure the objectives and just try and stop that last turn dash, and at some point over the course of the game, see if you can make a run on your opponent's objective, your opponent's beacon, and steal it. Mostly, though, this is planning to go second and play that kind of old Magic style of game where the Trinitarians just appear on the last turn and win, unless your opponent has gone to the effort of finding them with a sensor and killing them that way, which frankly is easier said than done. So really cool to finally feature a military order list on this channel, and I think this list is probably pretty okay. Now, our last and final new scenario in this pack is Zone of Interest. I will note, just to begin with, Corvus Belli, which one of you psychos decided that the deployment zones would be mirrored relative to provisioning? In fact, I think basically people who are already looking at running tournaments with this scenario are just saying, no, players, when you get up to a table, if we were also running provisioning, you just use the same deployment zones. It doesn't affect how the game is played. I really don't know what the logic was. Frankly, both of these scenarios should just have a line that says the players decide or the TO decides that one of the corners is the deployment zone. That is absent, but whatever. I've said it. Now let's move on to how the scenario actually plays. This is one of two radial deployment scenarios. That's not what they are officially called, but every War Machine player will know them as that. It's a good way of describing them. You have a 24-inch deep deployment zone extending from a table corner. This produces just a whole bunch of really interesting things in terms of Infinity. The first is that it massively screws up scenario, like table deployment. Deploying tables for radial terrain is like radial scenarios is really different. It's really interesting. It requires a whole new mental model. And you can accidentally make a really terrible table if you just follow the usual rules. However, if you get it right, it's really cool. Because what you have there, it's a smaller overall deployment zone than you would get if it was just a 12-inch wide strip, but it is a really deep deployment zone. And that means you can have a defense in depth that you wouldn't have if you were just deploying normally. If you think about attacking an enemy deployment zone in a normal scenario, what tends to happen is that you will hit the enemy deployment zone, and once you've made it to that point, you start having enfilade fire up the flank, and are often able to do like terrible, terrible damage. But in this scenario, in radial deployment scenarios, sure, it's actually quite easy to get to the enemy edge of the DZ, but once you've done that, it's just layer after layer after layer of models in cover looking at you. There's an onion of possible defensive depth rather than just an easy enfilade fire. To get those enfilade attacks, what you tend to actually have to do is make it all the way to the back table edge and then attack in from that angle. And that, unless you're a parachutist, requires a ton more movement. So these are actually kind of defensible deployment zones, despite the fact that they're a little bit small, because for lack of a better term, they kind of don't have flanks. Their exposed rear in particular is up against a corner and well defended, so it's not too difficult to defend these if the terrain is good. Another thing that it does is it just makes all of the distances bigger. It's more movement to get to everywhere. The only distance that is shorter is the straight line movement between the two deployment zones, but once you add the depth of the DZs in there, even that is kind of far. But if you are looking to get around the flanks, the paths you can take are really, really long, and the gunfights that can happen, even between a model at the front end of one deployment zone and the back of another, can be quite distant. So snipers become very good in this table setup, and it's just like some very interesting and different ways to play. In the game of provisioning that I have featured on this channel, I used Vistrals. In Tartary Army Corps, they are neurokinetic sapper snipers. Sapper snipers are very, very good here because you can deploy them at maximum distance. But just snipers generally, there's a bunch of stuff going on that's cool. In terms of how this scenario plays, it's also really interesting because I think it is the first end of round scoring supremacy-esque scenario that is actually weighted in favor of the attacker. So your mission objectives are at the end of each game, end of the game, dominate a zone of interest. There are 3 zone of interests represented by circular templates that are placed by the players. And so at the end of the game, each of those is worth 1 point. At the end of each game round, dominate the 1 zone of interest that is designated as special. We'll get to that. 3 points for that, 1 each game round. And then at the end of each game round, have the central antenna in the table activated. Finally, 1 classified. Now, to note, by the way, deploying HVTs in this scenario is an absolute laugh because you can deploy them so far from your opponent by putting them on a far table edge, just 4 inches outside your DZ. Very amusing. Anyway, those are all scoring considerations that look like they're very favored to the second player, because at the end of each game round, the second player has the chance to dominate the special zone of interest. At the end of each game round, the player has the chance to activate the communication antenna and have it be under their control. And so if we were to conceive of this as a scenario like Supremacy, for example, in Supremacy, which has the same setup for scoring, the same kind of scoring, end of game round scoring, those tend to be very favored for the second player because they can just defend and defend and defend and then move into the zone that will score them the points and then score the points and pass play back. Very favored for the second player. But I don't think that's the case in zone of interest because of how the zones of interest are set up and the antenna is activated. At the beginning of the game, after rolling for first player, the first player will place two zones of interest, one normal zone of interest and one special zone of interest, anywhere outside the deployment zone where there is space to fit the templates. That means that the first player will be placing those zones, including the one that is worth points throughout the game, basically just outside their DZ most of the time, usually in a location that is very hard to reach by the opponent. The second player, the one who normally has the easiest time if this was a supremacy style mission of securing those points, only gets to place one normal zone of interest, which is only worth 1 point at the end of the game. And so the person who is going first has huge amounts of control over where in particular the most valuable zone is placed, and they will prioritize putting that where it is easy for them to access, hard for the second player to access, and easy for them to defend. On top of that, we have the communication antenna. Now, it is flipped just like a normal antenna. You move up to it, you activate it. It's a short skill. It requires a specialist to make a willpower roll. Okay, cool. Where it gets weird is that the antenna defends itself. By the way, the rules here are a little bit weird, but I'm going to explain them as I understand them as best I can. When you go to activate the communication antenna, if your opponent has a hacker in a zone of interest, and you can't deploy in a zone of interest, so they have to have moved there, which means the first player is the only person who gets the chance to do this unopposed. If there is an enemy hacker in a zone of interest, then the roll to activate the antenna is a face-to-face roll against the willpower of a hacker, one hacker that your opponent chooses that is in a zone of interest. Now, first thing, most obvious thing, is it means the antenna defends itself. The antenna effectively has a willpower score that will oppose you as long as there is an enemy hacker in a zone of interest. If there is a good willpower enemy hacker, that can make flicking it back after the first player seizes it quite difficult. What's important and weird is that it's really best conceived of as the antenna defending itself. Selecting an enemy hacker to have their willpower be the face-to-face roll that your opponent is making is not the declaration of an arrow or the declaration of a short skill, and so does not, for example, prevent that hacker from having an ARO normally, or if they don't do anything, break a marker state. You can have a hacker camouflage, not hidden deployment, because hidden deployment isn't considered to be on the game table, but you can have a hacker in Cybermask or in a camouflage state in a zone of interest, passively defending the communication antenna, basically just volunteering their whip to the communication antenna so that it can defend itself, and your opponent doesn't necessarily have a means of dealing with that hacker. And so if you are the second player and your opponent moves a hacker into their zone of interest, and then camouflage or cybermasks it, and they've activated the antenna, you can have a real prick of a time trying to face-to-face roll your way through the antenna, and that hacker's not going to be revealing themselves doing that. Now, that's something that I think might change in terms of how this works. I am relatively confident in my interpretation. I have spoken to some other people about it. There's agreement that that's kind of the best way that this goes, but it does feel unintuitive. That's why I've presented this as you should think about it as the antenna defending itself, not actually the hacker in the zone a long way away doing something, because frankly, it gets way too weird. If this becomes an ARO, it opens up all sorts of interactions that we don't necessarily want. Just bear in mind that there's that little weird thing, but all of those collectively add up to a scenario that is very first player favored, even though the scoring is all second player. I think if you win the LT role in this, you pick first player basically 100% of the time, unless you have a very specific plan, but then you are going to need a plan for what you do if you are going second. This is probably the trickiest scenario to play from the second player position, I think, in the pack. And so, of course, the faction that I have chosen to potentially play this very, very difficult position is Aleph. Now, before we talk about the list, let me just say that this scenario name probably should be subject to change. I am a person who likes to write funny list names for lists, funny list names for lists that are built for scenarios. And so when I was putting this together, this was the second last list that I made for this video, I did a little bit of Googling. And I was not prepared for the historical context of the zone of interest. That is a phrase that has only been used once historically. It is from possibly the darkest part of the darkest period of modern history, and it is not possible to write a funny list name for this scenario. I got some pretty serious mood whiplash looking that up, and it's why the scenario list for critical intervention is kind of phoned in a little bit, and I would give some thought if I was Corvus Belli to just renaming this one, because it's just not worth having that being a thing. Now, that's the last that I'll mention of that, and with that said, because I do think it needed to be said, here is an Aleph list. Now, a little bit like the military orders list, I'm writing an Aleph list here just for the challenge of writing an Aleph list. I hadn't written an Aleph list in N5, I think, at all, and frankly, the ability to put a willpower 15 hacker under a marker state in a zone felt pretty relevant. Posthumans remain as good as ever, and this is a scenario that is using radial deployment and therefore favors snipers. And Hawkwood is probably the best ARO sniper in the game, and we can link him. And so what we're running here from top to bottom is Hawkwood in a fire team Haris with 2 Dalwons. Now, these things are very dangerous close assault. They can move out and attack. Feel like absolutely you can do that, especially if you're going first. There is a pretty reasonable chance that at some point during the game you'll have to move that Haris team out and get their hands dirty, but they can be purely defensive for much of the game. We then have a Myrmidian. A single Myrmidian, because this list otherwise only has a smoke grenade launcher and it isn't linked, and we are making enough sacrifices already. Myrmidians are quite good, but I did not have enough smoke in this list to be confident in my ability to advance if I didn't include this, so one model with smoke grenades. We then have a full proxy setup, a hacker, an engineer, and a forward observer. The hacker will mostly be dedicated to getting into a zone of interest and being annoying. The forward observer will probably be making your first run on the antenna, and the engineer will be hanging out with the Dakini in Combat Group 2. We've then got Penthesilea, she's excellent and she's very good at crossing distances in the scenario, and then the Garuda Spitfire. I am very outspoken on the Garuda, it is awesome, I love it very much, and this is a scenario where its angles to walk onto the board using Parachutist are exceptional. If you're going first in this scenario, you should assume that the critical zone of interest will be very difficult to reach with anything except drop troops and very fast elements. And so we've got Penny and we've got a Garuda, and in Group 2 we've got an Ectremos as well to make those attacks on that piece. At the end of rounds 1, 2, and 3, the goal is to have one of these pieces attack into, destroy any elements in the critical zone of interest, and then control the critical zone of interest for that essential 1 point each round. We've then got a Netrod and an Evo Hacker. Frankly, the Evo Hacker is probably not going to be using assisted drop. I don't think we will need it. We'll mostly be parachuting those pieces on. But apart from Hawkwood, the only long-range firepower piece in the entire list is that Dakini HMG in Group 2, and it's going to need some marksmanship with the work that we're demanding of it. We then got a Dakini, a K2 Auxilia. Now, its job is to hang out near the Evo Hacker and just throw paramines every turn out into the most annoying places on the table. That might be the central antenna, that might be the critical zone of interest or other zone of interest, just a very good piece for 12 points. We then have a Deva Lieutenant with a Deva bot. Frankly, look, in Aleph, our LT choices are a little thin on the ground, but we can use that LT order to move the Deva bot forward. The Deva itself is kind of hard to kill. It's a good piece for securing near zones, or flinging the Deva bot 10 inches to disarm mines and stuff in the midfield. I like the Deva Lieutenant, but it's one of those things where it's like, boy, I'd sure much rather have a Strategos of some description or something, because she is willpower 15, she'll give you the best shot at going first in this scenario. I wasn't, for example, willing to take Max because his willpower is too low, but she is a little bit of a tax. She will do some things, however. We've then got another Netrod, a Warcore, and then an Ectremos KHD. Ectremoi are pretty good, and the goal of this guy is to be one of those drop troops, one of those fast elements that makes a run in on the critical zone of interest if you are not the person who is going first. Now, overall, do I think this is an excellent list? No, but on the other hand, it's got 1 peripheral and 3 post-human, so it has a ton of actual models. It can ablate attacks very well. It's got at least 1 really good ARO piece. It's got some other interesting defenses. Its lieutenant is hard to kill. It does some cool stuff, and it should be able to play this scenario. I absolutely do think it's kind of reaching a little bit, but I haven't featured a vanilla Aleph list on this channel at all, I don't think, until now in N5, and I wanted to, and I think the faction fits the bill for this scenario reasonably well. And with that, that wraps up all 6 new scenarios featured in ITS Season 17. As I've mentioned throughout this video, overall I think my appraisal of this ITS pack is pretty positive. There are a few little things that they might need to tweak. They should clarify how HVT and treasure works in crossing lines. They should clarify how the interaction with the enemy hacker works in Zone of Interest. They should change the name for Zone of Interest. But broadly, basically all of these scenarios are cool and interesting, and even Crossing Lines, which is the memeiest of the new ones, actually plays very much like interesting and normal Infinity. It's just kind of high octane. So this is a very good Infinity pack. It's also a transformative Infinity pack. So many scenario changes, so many new things to learn. In a very real sense, this feels to me like Infinity N5.1. This is a major iteration to the game a year in without actually touching army balance or the core rules. Frankly, I would really have liked it if some of this had come with the ITS 16.2 pack. I get why it didn't. There are a number of possible reasons for that, but it is nevertheless a lot to digest and very interesting and exciting. What are your thoughts about ITS 17? What are your thoughts about the lists that I've thrown up today? Do you have a favorite scenario? Do you like any of these lists that I've posted? And would you be interested in seeing any of them in a battle report? Let me know in the comments. I make no promises, but I am interested in what people think and in what scenarios you'd be most interested in seeing featured on the channel. Otherwise, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this. As a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. We cover Infinity and other wargames. We try and release a video every week, and that means I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next week for more Infinity and wargaming content.